to the final event, the CODA of Alaska Quarterly Review's 40th anniversary series, celebrating AQR. This program is a little different than the previous 20. There's a couple of terrific writers, and there's also going to be a panel discussion. I'm Heather Lendy, and on behalf of the Center for Narrative and Lyric Arts, thank you for being here, and thank you for helping us reach our fundraising goal. Gunischish, as we say in Southeast Alaska, where I am, in Juneau this week, on the land of the Tlingit Ani, visiting my grandchildren, coming to you from my daughter's guest craft room. And now I'll turn it over to AQR editor Ron Spatz for the details of this very special program.
Thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Before we begin, I'd like to make a couple of very important acknowledgements. The first is acknowledging the Anchorage Museum that generously hosted all of these events and provided technical support. Also want to thank Web 907, our web team for Alaska Quarterly Review. And finally, the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes all of our events possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land. Land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples and marks our collective movement towards decolonization and equity. Today, we conclude our series, as Heather has mentioned, with an event titled Literary Milestones to Cornerstones. When I conceived of this event, it occurred to me that celebrating a milestone is not only the past, it's firmly in the past, it's dead. And what we need to do is to figure out how to take that stone, that milestone, that marker, and turn it into a cornerstone, a foundation for something that we can build on, something that is something to look at with a future lens in mind. And so today, we'll start the event with two of our writers that will transition from the regular series, a poet and a fiction writer. And then we're going to move to a panel discussion that will include our two writers and will be led by and moderated by Anchorage Museum CEO Julie Decker. And we'll also include the readers, myself, and acclaimed essayist, author, and physician Danielle Ofri, who is the co-founding editor of the Bellevue Literary Review, which, like AQR, is celebrating a literary milestone this year, its 20th anniversary. And so with that, I'm very excited that we are going to be having this treat of the readings and this conversation. And so I'm going to send it back to Heather Lendy. Heather is the author of 4 books, all published by Algonquin. If you lived here, I'd know your name. Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs. Find the Good, which is this year's Alaska Reads book, and her recently published Of Bears and Ballads. Heather?
Thanks, Ron. And it's really my privilege to be here and introducing everybody today. Our readers are a poet and a fiction writer. Danusha Laméris is the author of 2 collections of poems, The Moons of August, which was chosen by another AQR series presenter, my friend Naomi Shihab Nye, as the winner of the Autumn House Press Poetry Prize, and was a finalist for the Milt Kessler Book Award. Her second book is Bonfire Opera, and she was the 2020 recipient of the Lucille Clifton Legacy Award. Some of her poems have been published in the Best American Poetry, the New York Times, the American Poetry Review, of course, Alaska Quarterly Review, Prairie Schooner, The Sun, Tin House, the Gettysburg Review, and Ploughshares. She teaches poetry independently at danushalaméris.com and is Poet Laureate Emerita of Santa Cruz County, California. Of her teaching, Dion Riley, author of Ghost Dogs, Terrapin Press 2020, said, "She is welcoming and caring, possessed of an uncanny ability to apprehend her students' vision and style, the atmosphere of the world each poet inhabits. She fosters each writer's unique voice. Moreover, she is astute about what that voice fits, where that voice fits in the larger landscape of current American poetry." And Manini Nayer. Manini is the author of the collection Being Here, stories forthcoming in the spring of 2022 from the University Press of Kentucky. And her stories have appeared in Alaska Quarterly Review, the Bellevue Literary Review, whose editor is with us on the panel today, Chelsea, the Malahat Review, Boston Review, Words and Images, the London Magazine and Stand, and in the anthologies Signals, Rooted and Branching, Women Worldwide, and the O. Henry Festival stories. Her fiction has been recognized by the BBC World Service International Short Story Award, the Andre Dubus Short Story Award, and the Stand Magazine International Short Story Award, and broadcast internationally on the BBC Literary program, one of my favorites, Off the Shelf. Her work has also been featured by Interact Theater Company in Philadelphia in their Writing Aloud performance series, and she's been awarded literature fellowships from the Indiana Arts Council and the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, and is an associate teaching professor in English and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Of her novel, The Patchwork Variations, she says, "The work grew out of characters who emerged out of different moments in my life and from different places and times. In some ways, I suppose every character is a facet, hidden or overt, of any writer's consciousness." Also, she says the best advice she can give any writer is to read as much as you can of everything you can find. And with that, I'll turn it over to our readers, and we'll begin with Danusha.
Thank you so much, Heather, and so good to be with all of you. And I couldn't agree more with Manini about just read everything. And I think that will really tie into what we're talking about later too, about journals and cornerstones versus, what was their other word? Not cornerstones, but into milestones. I'm trying to get my stones right. And I also had some drilling going on here in the background, which I think has resolved, thankfully, but we will see. Anyway, thank you all for having me here. Thank you for inviting and introducing me. And I like to start with an invocation. And in this case, just a very little poem about the heart called "The Heart Is Not." The New York Public Library has people write these tiny, tiny poems to put in people's pockets as they leave the library. And so I wrote this for that. The heart is not a pocket, a thing that can be turned inside out by anybody's hand. Not a place for pebbles or loose change, not to carry old receipts. It does not tear at the seam. It does not have a seam. It cannot be torn. So that's my little pocket poem about the heart. And I wanted also, of course, to read poems that I've had in the Alaska Quarterly Review, which is actually one of the first places that published my poems. So thank you to Ron for that. But yeah, so from my first book, I have some poems here that were in AQR early on. And one is called Pigeons. Because they crowd the corner of every city street. Because they are the color of sullied steel. Because they scavenge, eating every last crust. We do not favor them. They raise their young, huddled under awnings above the liquor store. circle our feet, pecking at crumbs, pace the sidewalk with that familiar strut. None will ever attain greatness. Though every once in a while, in a tourist's blurry snapshot of a grand cathedral, they rise into the pale gray sky all at once. So that's pigeons. And I like to think of them having a grand moment, and I think they do. I was watching a flock of them recently flying in formation, and I thought, well, that's pretty elegant, you know. We don't want to overlook the lowly pigeon. They certainly have their moments. And this next poem is the title poem, actually, of this first book. So it's called The Moons of August, and it's after a poem by Dorian Lux. There are many names for this sullied coin, this brandy-soaked pearl, fruit moon, lightning moon, moon when all things ripen. We stand by the creek, watch it float between the black tips of the pine, grain moon, full sturgeon moon, green corn moon. I count my losses in the dark. Why not call it cracked quartz moon, roll of the dice moon, hard luck moon? Must we always speak of harvest? Crickets throb in the dusky vines. A bat flits above our heads. Oh, watcher, you who see all that is born and all that dies, tonight I name you, switchblade moon, toss in the towel moon, moon turning to sand, empty rice bowl, dust moon, salt moon, ash moon, blink of an eye moon. Somehow, reading that, I thought of one of my best friends in the 8th grade. She was born in Taiwan, and she said most insults in Chinese have to do with rice. I don't know why. I guess empty rice bowl. That sounded to me like it might have been one of those insults. If somebody had a tendency to eat a lot, she said you'd call them a veritable rice bowl or bucket. That's how she translated it. And I really like the veritable in there, translated by an 8th grader. It's pretty sweet. So I guess a couple more before we get to hear from Manini. Oh, okay. I wrote one down that's a bit of a gardening poem because some gardeners have been sharing it lately, which reminded me that it exists. A poem I wrote some years ago called Feeding the Worms. I guess we're talking about pigeons and worms and these kind of things today. Ever since I found out that earthworms have taste buds all over the delicate pink strings of their bodies, I pause, dropping apple peels into the compost bin. Imagine the dark, writhing ecstasy, the sweetness of apples permeating their pores. I offer beets and parsley, avocado and melon, the feathery tops of carrots. I'd always thought theirs a menial life, eyeless and hidden, almost vulgar, though now it seems they bear a pleasure so sublime, so decadent. I want to contribute, however I can, forgetting a moment my place on the menu. Goes a little dark there. That's what we do. That's what we do, right? That's our job. So maybe one more small one, and I'll pass things to Manini. And this one I chose because Ron and I, on the phone before this event, found ourselves talking about Chef's Table. I don't know who watches that. Certainly I have. But just the decadence of all that food. I'm going to take a little sip of water. And this poem was born around a table of poets talking. And I was saying, isn't it strange how almost everything tastes good? Prepared right. You can eat almost everything that lives or grows. And so that led to this poem, Edible. That and thinking of a friend I'd lost. So we want it all. Potatoes pulled up from under their poison foliage. The artichoke's heart scraped clean. The tender bodies of crustaceans broken from their calcified shells. Saffron stamens plucked from the crocus's center. Bark of cinnamon trees. Slow sugar tapped from the maple. The golden vomit of bees, pride from its waxen vaults. Even for some, the delicate crunch of crickets or hind legs of lamb, still tinged with blood. The world is such an unexpected feast. I think of my friend Christopher, who, when he found himself dying early one spring, kept telling us how this was the best part, the letting go. As if in his hunger, he'd somehow broken into death's core, torn off the husk, the brittle shell, found inside the succulent heart, and savored it. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. They were beautiful. Manini?
Thank you, Danusha. Those poems were lovely. And thank you also, Heather, for such a kind introduction. And a big thank you, of course, to Ron and to AQR. And I'm delighted to be part of this wonderful series and to be with all of you here. I did want to say that being published in so distinguished a periodical, a journal as AQR, has been one of the highlights of my writing life. And I did want to add also that the story that was published in Alaska Quarterly Review is actually the cornerstone of the collection that's to be published by the University of Kentucky next spring. So almost every story in that collection links back to the AQR story, including the one that was in Bellevue. So thank you all very much. And Ron, a heartfelt thank you to you. The story I'm going to read today is a little different. It was written in response to recent events. And I was thinking of the way history repeats itself, how it loops around, and how everything is the same and how nothing is the same. And I was hoping also that this story connects in some way, even if in counterpoint, with the topics for discussion, things like literary journals and their relevance and their connection to our public discourse on questions of race, gender identity, social justice, and of course, healing. So this story, I call this my recursive history story. And it's called Isfahan is Half the World. And it was written, well, I keep tinkering with it. So it's been written over, I guess, several months. It's about a young woman who comes to America soon after 9/11 and who stays on and makes a life for herself here. It runs just under 11 minutes. So a little heads up there. So Isfahan is half the world. 2 towers, a purple banana, a linen shirt, a travel clock without a face, a woman in an airport line, a plane, all of which together could make up a Dali painting, but not a history. Half-dazed, I got off the United Airlines plane in New York in September 2002, still eating that rancid banana, all crumpled in my jeans and linen shirt, a smashed travel clock in my luggage. I am a painting in that moment without history, a set of daubs and wriggles on an airport canvas. Arrival is an art of its own unmaking. Two towers like gateposts across the world, and beyond, conflicts without borders in a blaze of light. By the time I stepped off that plane, 9/11 was already a single word, a word so full of its own weight it sank into silence as it was spoken, a word that implied that the fate of the world was immediate and distant, like overhanging scaffolding on a broken beam. From afar, the word held mystery and threat. In America, it was a keening. And behind it all, chaos and sorrow, but of a kind cinematic in a blurred and parallel realm. But more immediately, a sharp-eyed customs man. "What's in your bag, ma'am?" And the meekness of my response, "Just papers, money, a passport, cosmetics, a clock, no perfume bottles, no cologne. You can move on." 7-Eleven had been the magic word. Uncles, family, friends, the gardener's affluent brother-in-law, they were 7-Eleven men, each with a convenience store in New Jersey or Indiana, and an additional bank account in Mumbai, Calcutta, Pune. People who traded candy bars and toiletries over counters to strangers with dollar bills and cars growling in the lot, still in gear. 7-Eleven was the gateway to America. 9/11 shut the door. Well, that was the story I was told. Be very careful. Sikhs have been killed for wearing turbans. Tekbir Singh, a man in jail for spelling his name out loud at JFK. T for terrorist, E for Ibrahim, K for Kalashnikov. He thought his hijinks made him appealing to airport authorities. He was from Ludhiana in the Punjab. Guantanamo sounded like a gecko or a Mexican song. Not so, he found out the wrong way. His was the cautionary tale. Watch your step, be a good girl, visit Disney World, get a bank account. A husband, maybe, but not necessarily. There are suitable options in India as well. My parents waved me off at the New Delhi airport. I left them lonely, waving back before boarding the United Airlines airplane, armed with the promise of a graduate fellowship at Syracuse. I left with $200, a leather suitcase, and a list of things to do. Here was my list: Baywatch, McDonald's, Macy's, the Mall of America, baseball, and why it wasn't cricket, fuzzy bedroom slippers, pineapple pizza, crime, but not directly, everything in Washington, D.C., the United Nations, Dustin Hoffman, God, the American version in good clothing. I can't say I had much success with the list, except for the pizza and McDonald's, neither of which required much effort, but could be brought to your door or requested over a squawky receptor. Baywatch was in reruns, and the slippers gave me a sense of squashing things underfoot. And meeting God in your Sunday best was disconcerting, rather like an appointment with a criminal defense lawyer who barely believed your protestations, but felt obliged to anyway. Dustin Hoffman had grown old. So it's fair to say my America didn't quite work out as planned, except for graduate school and friends who were inevitable in a crowded dorm. "What sort of name is Stelina?" demanded James, my dorm room neighbor. "Is that really your name? Is it Sanskrit?" He was told all Indian names originate in Hindu mythology, trailing weights of impossible expectations. His Indian names were Sanjay Gupta and Pico Iyer, maybe a Raj or two, a Kumar and a Patel. The Amartya Sens and Sundar Pichais were still down the road. "Not very," I admitted, "sort of made up. My dad was a poet." "News to me," said James, but didn't challenge the information. He was a Sunday best sort of fellow. Live and let live if you weren't the same, all God's children. He offered me half of his bologna sandwich, and a year later, a diamond ring. I think sometimes of that man from Ludhiana. I give him a history and a future. I fill in gaps and add flourishes. His is my other story. So Tekbir Singh comes from a village in the Punjab where the Green Revolution was in bloom until the government subsidies grew scarcer, the competition greater. He decided to take his chances with his brother-in-law in New York, who ran a taxi service. The man from Ludhiana applied for the immigration lottery. He was chosen. What happens next is anybody's guess. Perhaps he moved in with his sister and brother-in-law after the stint in jail and a host of warnings from the local FBI. He bought 2 taxis. He married a woman from the Bronx, and they had 2 bonny children, a boy and a girl. He bought a house in Queens and flew the Stars and Stripes outside his front door to ward off suspicious neighbors. And so his turban would be seen as a sign of melting pot solidarity, not a threat. His neighbors agreed he was a splendid fellow. His son was partial to the Knicks. His daughter became a popular high school cheerleader. They all lived happily ever after. Or not. Perhaps he stayed in jail. Perhaps the authorities found just cause for terroristic intentions. Perhaps he was deported. Or perhaps, as neither extreme seems likely, he found work as a part-time doorman on the Upper East Side, where beautiful women breezed past him through the shimmering glass doors, through the shining foyer, up the speedy elevator, into a different ether. He smiled and learned the tricks of murmured compliance. Good morning, sir or madam. What a beautiful day it is today. He flattened his growling consonants to please the American ear. He was the right sort of immigrant, grateful and upbeat. One day, the beautiful women said to one another on their way to the elevator, he will have a fleet of taxis. Such a charming man. I try out written drafts of all three versions. I show James my Louisiana man stories, but he is unimpressed. Just another immigrant story, says James politely, full of cliches, really. My own story loops an easy arc from A to Z without much drama in between. The in-between is baskets of unwashed laundry, summers in Hawaii, chicken biryani recipes, a near-cancer scare, and a beat-up old Toyota. The stuff of life, really. Nothing that resets a broken clock. I married James and never regretted it. We are older now, and other than an unexpected affair in midlife, James has remained a good partner. Our marriage is an agreeable constant. We smile at each other over breakfast cups of coffee. We celebrate birthdays and anniversaries with cake and fervent declarations. We live without distress. Our ranch-style house in Eau Claire has a flowing yard with red geraniums in a pot outside the front door, a blue and white striped awning over the deck, a barbecue with room for 5 steaks and a single row of potatoes. We hang an Etsy sign on our front door that says, "In this house we believe Black lives matter, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, love is love, science is real, kindness is everything." We see these signs spring up everywhere on immaculate front lawns. We tell ourselves we are good people. When Minneapolis was burning, yes, one among many cities, I thought of 7-Elevens, not the falling towers, but the frightened men huddled in their dusty shops, waiting for ICE or the police to beat them out of hiding. People with mounds of basmati rice to sell and mango pickles on a shelf. Mosques emptied and hearts in quarantine. My other story, Man from Louisiana, has become a ghostly presence on the borders of the city. He will not go away. We are all now writing stories, sometimes in memory, sometimes in air. The wind lifts and passes us in gusts. Our stories scatter over continents, camouflaged histories we cannot share. We await an apocalypse, or at least a bloodless street and a safe vaccine. Our words tell us we will survive. Our fingers knit and pearl, pearl and knit. The towers fell, and they are falling still. Thank you for listening.
Oh, thank you. That was just wonderful. A great way to start off the panel and a fabulous way to end the literary part of our 40th anniversary series. Thank you very much, both of you. I think now I am going to go ahead and introduce the panel, who will take us through about the next 45 minutes or so. Julie Decker is the director and CEO of the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center, which is a leading center for scholarship, engagement, and investigation of Alaska and the North. Her career has been focused on the people and environment of Northern places and building projects and initiatives that are in service to local and global communities. Before becoming director and CEO, she served as the museum's chief curator. She's curated and designed numerous exhibitions, taught classes, and authored and edited numerous publications on subjects ranging from contemporary art and architecture of the North to many aspects of the Arctic environment and histories. Her books include one of my favorites, Quonset Hut, Metal Living for the Modern Age, Found and Assembled in Alaska, a catalog to the exhibition organized by the Alaska State Museum here in Juneau, True North, New Alaskan Architecture, Alaska and the Airplane, A Century of Flight, I Am Inuit, Portraits of Places and People of the Arctic, Wandering Ecologies, The Landscape Architecture of Charles Anderson, John Hoover, Art and Life, Icebreakers, Alaska's Most Innovative Artist. Julie Decker, who says, for museums and their collections to be visible and viable, they are best when they are connected to and relevant to audiences and participants. They have the capacity to address relevant civic issues and imagine possible futures. Danielle Ofri is the co-founder and editor-in-chief, as we've heard earlier, of the Bellevue Literary Review, the first literary journal to arise from a medical setting, and also celebrating a big anniversary this year. Congratulations. She is an internist at Bellevue Hospital and is a clinical professor of medicine at NYU School of Medicine and one of the foremost voices in the medical world today. Her lectures to medical and general audiences are renowned for her use of dramatic storytelling and no PowerPoints, or few. Her essays have been selected by Stephen Jay Gould, Oliver Sacks, and Susan Orlean for the Best American Essays twice and Best American Science Writing. Danielle Ofri has given TED Talks on deconstructing perfection and fear, a necessary emotion, and has also performed stories for The Moth and is featured in a new documentary titled Why Doctors Write. She's also the author of 6 books: Singular Intimacies, Becoming a Doctor at Bellevue, Incidental Findings, Lessons from My Patients in the Art of Medicine in Translation, Journeys with My Patients, What Doctors Feel, How Emotions Affect the Practice of Medicine, What Patients Say, What Doctors Hear, and most recently, When We Do Harm, A Doctor Confronts Medical Error. Her writing appears regularly in the New York Times, as well as in the New Yorker, Slate, The Lancet, and the New England Journal of Medicine, and more. All this, and she has been working on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic in New York City. Thank you for your service, Dr. Ofri. Ronald Spatz is co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Alaska Quarterly Review, a professor of English and a founder of the Honors College and Office of Undergraduate Research here at the University of Alaska. He's a former National Endowment for the Arts Fellow and the recipient of a Contribution to Literacy Award from the Alaska Center for the Book. In his 2 Alaska Governor's Awards, Arts and Humanities, Ron was cited for a record of extraordinary leadership, creative vision, and significant accomplishment and major contributions to Alaska. His work has appeared in a wide range of journals and anthologies, including New Letters, Fiction, the Transatlantic Review, The Little Magazine in America, Spreading the Word, Editors on Poetry, The Whole Story, Editors on Fiction, and in Dreamlight. For his entire career, a lifetime really, 40 years, Ron has lived and breathed AQR. He has managed, edited, and along with an impressive team, has overseen every aspect of the publication of AQR's book-length collections of fine writing and graphic art that have earned the journal acclaim for its content and its beauty. He insists on the colorful photo covers. Since 1982, when Ron Spatz and co-founder James Liska published the first edition, AQR has continued to receive accolades. The New York Times Book Review called it fresh treasure. Library Journal highly recommends it and says, as always, it deserves applause. And both the Washington Post and the New York Review of Books have praised AQR as one of the nation's best literary magazines. Ron Spatz, who says, if the works published in AQR have certain characteristics, they are freshness, honesty, and a compelling subject. The voice of the piece must be strong. I look for the demonstration of craft, making the situation palpable and putting it in a form where it becomes emotionally and intellectually complex. Well, this should be quite a chat. Julie Decker will be guiding the panel. Julie, it's all yours.
Thanks, Heather. Thank you, Heather. And thank you, Manini and Danusha, for your readings. Those were beautiful. I appreciate you sharing them. Welcome, Danielle. And thanks to Heather and Ron for hosting. I will just say on behalf of the Anchorage Museum, we've been very pleased to partner with AQR on this series and to have an agreement to collaborate into the future on a series similar like this, but also in other ways that we might support writers and the literary arts. I know I have looked to writers over the past year for meaning making and to process the world around us and our futures. As a museum, we think storytelling and multiple perspectives are really critical for an understanding of place and people, and for developing empathy and to envision a better tomorrow. So thank you to the speakers today, the readers, and throughout this series for their voices and for helping us to see, hear, learn, and experience. We have a few questions today about writing and reading. Any of the panelists are welcome to jump in and to answer and to reflect as you wish. And maybe I'll start with one of the more expected questions, which is what has been the impact of our pandemic, the shared global experience of the last year, also of social and racial justice, and what is the impact on the literary arts, on your work, on writers, and who is the writer of today, and what should we be reading?
Well, I'll jump in. So that's a lot of question. That's many questions there. So maybe we can pull it apart a little bit. So I think the effect of the pandemic most immediately on the literary arts is certainly it destabilized many arts organizations, including literary arts. And so many of them, I think, struggled economically. On the flip side, many people had much more free time and people really turned to reading. And I think, book sales certainly were up in some categories and people were reading online. And I think it maybe offered a window into the possibility that when people suddenly are changed out of what they've been used to, that reading is always there for you. And I've been heartened to see that there has been certainly some good in that. And certainly of all the racial awakenings and economic awakenings, I think that's then brought kind of a wider audience to the wider variety of writers. And I think people suddenly realize, and maybe they should have realized all along, that we have, in fact, many writers, internationally and nationally that we can reach. And there's been a recognition that we can include quite a bit more variety than what we're used to, sort of the typical literary publication. So I think it's both been a challenge, but it really has offered opportunities. And I'll say one thing is an event like this, pre-pandemic, we would have a reading, it would be locally, and whoever could show up, and you were limited to your local area. Now suddenly we can have events and readings that, reach international and national audiences and can welcome people who can't, participate normally. And that allows people, who may have, let's say, mobility issues to be part of events that couldn't have before. So there are many possibilities. So I feel fairly optimistic that this will add some benefit and make the literary arts, I think, more accessible.
I love getting the doctor's perspective that includes mobility issues, because that is such a huge part. I've heard so many people say that they're hearing from friends, they really hope that the online presence continues because they're not able to travel or not able to attend readings physically. So this is a huge issue. And with closed captioning as well, we can make it more available for hearing impaired people. So that's sort of an untapped well, isn't it? That's opened up this year. To realize that we can get together in this way is so, it seems so obvious right under our noses, but I wasn't using this platform for teaching, and now I am. Everything shifts. But I think another thing I would add to what Danielle said is there's a sense of shattering of the known, this year. So we were all in, you know, people get in a groove. We have the way we go about our lives, the way we work, the way we live. And so much of that has been completely turned on its head. And so when there's a great deal of uncertainty and a great deal of grief, suffering of different kinds, I think people really look for how to address that. And I think people are looking toward the arts in a very real way. They're reading poetry. They're definitely attending to this as a kind of sanctuary or a temple, to find meaning and to find healing. And so I think that's another aspect of it, is that it's a time when things have shattered. And that's where leaps come from in the arts as well, for the maker and for those who are taking it in.
Well,
If I,
what I think is important that you just said, Danusha, is the idea that there's healing involved in the writing, the narrative. And going back a number of years, decades, when I first worked with Danielle briefly, I was attracted to her work related to narrative medicine. And the nature for us is that we live and breathe stories, whether they are in poetry form, whether they are in painting, whether they are in music. They are always embedded in art and how we express ourselves. So the literary arts are what we're talking about here, but all of them are absolutely essential in so many ways. And I think the pandemic has made that clearer as people have been kind of put into their own bubbles, if you will. You know, their stories then were insular, but they began to think who they are, and then they were hearing other people's stories. And as you said, Danusha, I think it's really important that the technology now is something that is our friend. It isn't always. For example, Facebook may not be our friend, but these meetings are actually in some ways more intimate than the meeting of a reading where you go into an auditorium live. These are much closer in. You get to observe the people who are presenting. You get to see sometimes where they live, what their artifacts are. You certainly get to see their expressions. And so I think the point of it is, and again, I'm really excited that Danielle agreed to this, is because at the way I viewed it, and of course I told my own story about who she is and what she does. We haven't had that many conversations, but I saw the magazine coming out of the need to actually support the literary arts, because narrative medicine is about how doctors can be better doctors by understanding stories of people, that they have to make quick decisions when they're hearing in a clinical setting what's wrong with somebody or what they think is wrong with them. But understanding the story and the nuances and how we communicate is essential to wellness and actually creating an opportunity for healing. I wondered, if Danielle, would you weigh in on that just a little about the nature of, you think of the narrative as a healing mechanism, aside from the pandemic and all of that, but in general, what your thoughts are about that. And maybe even the roots of the Bellevue Literary Review, which, by the way, I admire greatly what you did. And that's, we have a different, and it might come to it, we had a different reason for starting Alaska Quarterly. Ours is more general, but we are far away from the center of publishing. Yours is more specific, and you are in the center of publishing there in New York. We have, when we started, a situation where there were really no doorways to the national, international communities from Alaska. And in fact, we were so disconnected when I came up here in 1980, we didn't even get the news on time. They actually had to send, the news up from Seattle on these big, I guess it were 3-inch or 1-inch tapes, videotapes. And so we weren't even getting that on time. So to create an outward facing journal that would bring the world to us was something we were looking at. But the nature of healing is the same, whether or not, we have, inward facing, outward facing. I just wondered if you'd comment about that just a little bit, and about the nature of, Bellevue in terms of, why you started it. And also, one of the things I'd like to get to today is where we go from here. So this is a little bit, more focused. It was kind of my idea behind it, because I'm worried about that. So I don't want to say anything negative, but I'm worried about the future. I'm worried in our country we don't support the arts in the way, say, Canada does, or other countries do, where they care about the arts as something inherent. We don't do that. America is capitalist about the arts, and it's about, in a lot of ways, what sells, as opposed to what's important. They're not the same thing. They're not the same stories. But I wonder a little bit more about the Bellevue Literary Review as its genesis, and then move into the healing. And then maybe we could actually bring Manini into the conversation too.
So let me first just show a copy of the BLR that Janini's story was published just about 2 years ago, a beautiful story. So we started 20 years ago, and partly I had been, I have students who give me their patient write-ups, their history and physicals about the patient's illness. And once you've read 10, 20, 40, 60 of them, they're all kind of the same. And so I asked them to, just ask the patient, what is it like to have diabetes or emphysema? And they started handing in these really wonderful essays, stories about their patients. At the same time, we had a new chair of medicine who also asked his students to write an essay inspired by a patient. And so we got together, someone introduced us, and we thought, wouldn't it be great to have sort of a student journal with these writings? But we thought, there's really much more of a universal, I think, interest in these topics. You may go through life and never need a roofer or a plumber or a lawyer, and you'll be lucky, but you'll never get through life and avoid the medical system. And even if you eat your bran every day, it's your aging parents or your child or your community. And certainly the pandemic has brought that out, more than anything of late. And so we decided to make a literary journal with that focus. And we took out, a 2-line call for submissions, and we had 1,000 submissions right away. So it was clear that we had touched a nerve. And these weren't just doctors and nurses writing, but really a general public who had lots to say, grappling with illness and vulnerability, fears that our body or mind may not support us when we want them to, is really universal. And I think that plane of vulnerability that illness taps into is a similar plane of creativity of how we write. And it's not, I think, no accident that many people have been inspired by brushes with mortality and illness to write about that. And interestingly, so we started, our first issue went to press in September of 2001. In fact, it was Ofri Press when 9/11 happened. And here we were starting this new journal. Of course, we had this enormous tragedy here in New York and in the US. And we planned for the first week in October, kind of our gala debut reading celebration. And of course, nobody was in a celebratory mood. And we went back and forth, like, what do we do? Do we cancel? Do we do this? We've already lined everyone up. We're doing it at the hospital at Bellevue. And of course, at the time, the entranceway to Bellevue's were just lined with the posters of the missing. And you had to walk down that hall. In fact, it was so traumatic because, of course, at this point, all those missing people had perished. And these were the most happy photos that people had posted, families had posted, wedding photos and graduation photos. So there are all these smiling faces you had to see every morning on their way to work. So traumatic. They had to open a back door so staff could take the back door, and they needed to. Anyway, we decided to hold the reading, the first week of October, see, will anyone show up? It was for 7 o'clock or 5 o'clock at night. Around noon that day, the US dropped the first bombs in Afghanistan and the war started. We thought, oh, that's it. Nobody is gonna come. We're now at war. It was packed. It was standing room only. We had more than 100 people come to a public hospital in New York City for a poetry and prose reading for which you had to walk past a sort of gauntlet of grief to get to. And I think it speaks to what Danusha was saying, is that when people are hurting and afraid and feeling vulnerable, we do turn to the arts. And it's not an accident that this is where we go. I mean, we have the news for the facts, and we have, textbooks for, how to treat your osteoporosis, but that doesn't really help us when we are grappling with the existential fears. So I agree, Ron, that these are things that are essential, and they're not froth or just, extra desserts, but really crucial. And of course, I do hope that, we take that seriously and fund that and support that. But I think I'll leave that for another round of questions, because I think there's more here, and I want to let other people have a chance to weigh in.
Manini, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. I was thinking, I actually wanted to pick up from something Danielle had just mentioned about the emotional urgency of art and how we tend to write when we're on the brink of things. And I actually took down a quote, and I wanted to read it to you, by Audre Lorde. And this was written, it's from an essay I'm sure you read. It's called The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. And when she was told she had cancer and she didn't have very long to live, this is what she said. And when I was reading that, it sort of connected in a strange way with the pandemic for me and the way in which we approach art. So I'd just like to read a couple of sentences. She said, when she found that was told she had cancer, she said, "I was forced into an involuntary reorganization of my entire life. I was forced to look upon myself and my living with a harsh and urgent clarity that has left me shaken, but much stronger." And echoing those words, I think the pandemic has sort of reorganized our emotional priorities as writers, to some extent at least, because there's a greater awareness of being on this edge of things, illness, racial conflicts, loss and death. Not that this wasn't there in the past, of course it was, but now it's almost like a national and daily reckoning. And I do see it reflected in the kinds of work we see published today. Claudia Rankin, Terence Hayes. In fact, Victoria Chang, I think she was on the series a while ago. I was reading her poems from Orbit. And there are so many writers, of course, I'm just picking out a few from, So in this very awful and terrible way, the pandemic has made us aware of our mutuality. Whether we like it or not, we are in this together. And that is reflected, I think, in the way in which we write and read. So.
Julie, do you?
Yeah, being conscious of time, I'm going to pose one final question, if each of you could respond, which is, what does the literary landscape look like for the future, in the future? How do we get there? And what's the anthology of the future?
Oh, that's a lot there. I think the literary landscape looks ever richer. I think, what Manini was just saying is that, yes, all these issues have existed before, but for one moment, we're all on the same page. And that's a rarity. And I think, and partly we've had the luxury of, not being in the middle of a pandemic in an urgent situation. So we can, we block out many things and focus on our minutiae of the day to day. And this really reset us all at the same time. And that's an unusual thing. And it's both terribly disorienting, but also does offer opportunity. And I think that the way we can get the most from this is to look at the opportunities, to see what the pandemic has wrought. And maybe there is now the energy to start focusing on these issues with more urgency, but also looking forward as, we don't have to live the way we were living. Just because we were doesn't mean that's the only way to do it. There are more ways to imagine how we can live as a society, as a neighborhood, as a country. And it's very heartening to see that people look at, things can change and things can change overnight. I mean, so many things, even just, I'll think in the hospital, things that we couldn't do for so long, well, suddenly we could do them. You couldn't work from home in a hospital, never. And then overnight, boom, suddenly you could. Well, boy, if you can change that overnight, why can't we change other things? Why can't we think more creatively? Aren't there are more than one way to do things in the way we've been doing them all along. And I think this extends to many, many facets of life. There's so many ways that we can be having national conversations, how we can be affecting change on political levels, on local levels. we don't have to do what we're doing just because that's what we were doing. And I think the same can be said about the literary world and the arts world in general. We've had, as Ron mentioned, at least in the US, a fairly capitalist, approach to arts. And that's why Broadway shows cost $200 a ticket, because that's the price the market will bear. And of course, so many people can't access these shows and so much culture, but does it have to be that way? Can we reimagine things? And I see now that we also have an appetite for learning about things we don't already know about, to learn about cultures we don't know about. We have the chance to be exposed to them because I think that the digital options give us a chance that you can, attend a reading in another country. Just recently, I was invited by some students in London to give a talk, which in the past I never could have done, but now I could have a conversation with these medical students, 6,000 miles away. And we can do this. I'm in New York, you're in Alaska, and we can have that conversation. So I think that we have lots of opportunity. And I think now the appetite, I think we want to be in different places. And the same thing happened in the hospital. In the hospital, I would only go to conferences in my department because that's what I went to. Now they were all online. I started going to other conferences, pulmonary, and I could go to critical care conferences and cardiology conferences. And there's so much you can learn and people to meet you haven't met before. So I'm optimistic that we now have opportunities to bring more people into the conversation because there's more conversations to be had, both in writing, in fine arts and performing arts. And I'm hoping that the public has also recognized that arts do need to be supported. I think people are now starting to recognize that, all of our theaters are shuttered. Do we want to stay forever with no theater, no live music? And I think the answer is no, we need them. And we suddenly recognize the importance of paying for that. And maybe we'll, be more motivated to help organize our government to say, that's where we want some of our tax money to go to support these arts because we do need them.
I would just weigh in and say that it's more than just simply telling our government something. I think it's going to need some very forceful advocacy. So I can't be as positive, perhaps because we're smaller and we're about as far away from the center right now. We're actually at the nexus of all kinds of things in Alaska with the environment. I mean, we're actually totally at the right place for the things that affect the world. But in terms of capitalism and exchange of money and potentially the centers of publishing, we're pretty far away from that. And where the advocacy has to come in is where people wouldn't believe either that doctors need to read stories in order to become better doctors. Anytime I tell students who like literature and want to be doctors and they wonder if that's some kind of crazy cognitive dissonance for them, I tell them that, oh, well, look, there are courses for doctors in whole departments, like at Columbia, there's narrative medicine. There is part of the curriculum that you have to take as a physician. If people could understand more, and this is where the advocacy, and I wonder if Manini and Danusha can weigh in on this a little bit, but the advocacy somehow has to come from the STEM people. The STEM people have to say why the arts are so important, which is a little bit opposite of what you would think, because some of the STEM people know it's important, but just think about even the way grants work in the sciences. You don't always get to do what you think is important. You follow where somebody else says there's money, you go for the pot of money. I remember having a chat with Roger Chen, who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. He talked about how his interest in a team of people were interested in how jellyfish light up. That was not something that was going to be funded, and it never was something that was funded. So they took a big risk by working on how jellyfish light up. Turns out once you understand how jellyfish light up, and by the way, his interest in it was that he loved color. So we have this chemist who won the Nobel Prize who loves color. He loves vibrancy. He loves the natural world, wants to find out about it, which is what artists do. There's a big, huge connection between the arts and the sciences. In any event, they did it. They found applications after they understood it. They made the connections. You can inject those phosphorus particles into cells and they light up. He gave an example for breast cancer that they were experimenting with trying to just get each individual cell to light up a particular color. So you wouldn't be working at clusters of cells, even a single one. In theory, you might be able to, it's got them all excited. They won the Nobel Prize. So I think there's going to be a lot more need for advocacy. I think that, that what I'm attracted to you, Danielle, is that you are a scientist, but also you love the arts. You play cello, you love literary arts, you're willing to go to bat for them. But you see, that is not necessarily the view that people have of what you might be interested in. Okay, I mean, that wouldn't be what they would think. Somehow we have to find a way to, in fact, have advocacy for the importance of the literary arts and all the arts and the humanities. Because without it, we get the polarization in our country in part because the humanities have been lost. That's part of my take on it. We need to have those things that tell us how to live our lives, how to discuss values, how to understand identity, how to test our ideas. I think people are so susceptible to Facebook and other things because they just haven't really been exposed to it in a theoretical way, and there isn't any real advocacy for it. So, I'm not pessimistic because I like you. I love the Zoom in a lot of ways. You can do things in classes you couldn't do before. Now, there's some things you can't do that frustrate me, but there's some things you can do. And eventually, we're going to be able to get there with some of these technologies. But we're never going to be getting there with the humanities and the literary arts unless we have that advocacy with the connection to the real world. So it isn't there where people anecdotally go when they're hurting. It's where the doctors need the stories in order to be better doctors, if you follow what I mean. And so I don't know how we get there. I mean, at some point I'm going to ask Julie how we get there because she runs one of the largest arts organizations that has a very big umbrella. And we've been very grateful to her, our little AQR. Like you, we left our institution, but we're in a much smaller place. We don't have the same kind of infrastructure when we left our institution. Our board is a little different than your board, which is, in terms of magnitude, scale, and resources. So I wonder if Manini and Danusha could just weigh in a little bit on this idea of the kind of advocacy that not only writers do directly, right, but the kind of advocacy that like you'd like to see happen, or how you think that it can happen. How can we convince people that a literary magazine is important, that everything doesn't have to be the New Yorker? How the backstage scaffolding of the literary arts is what brings you to the New Yorker. If you don't build up the stuff in the background, how are you going to get there? How are you going to raise all of these really talented voices? There's not room in the New Yorker for everybody right away, and nor does there have to be everybody reading the New Yorker. There have to be lots more gateways. So what do you guys have that you can feel passionate about, that after this CODA for our series, after 40 years, and technology has changed, but a lot of the same problems are the same, actually. So I just wondered what Danusha and then Manini, and I'd like to hear from you, Julie. I'd like to know what you think is the head of one of Alaska's most important arts organizations, with a big outward-facing side to it too, which, by the way, in some communities is not what people want. They want a mirror as opposed to a doorway, but that's a different concern. Danusha, what do you think? And then we go to.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. I think that obviously it's a big topic and we could spend some time on it, and it would be great to have more space to at some point. But I think in times of more complexity, there's definitely more possibility that arises as well from this fragmentation, as we've been saying. New modes of communicating, new modes of engaging with journals are really opening up, even associating workshops with a journal, different streams of revenue, certainly, but also new connections, I think, are really the key, and new communities. People are really wanting and enjoying and valuing being part of a community in a very different way than I think we were before this pandemic. So having human connection takes on a different kind of meaning, and we can cross-pollinate communities. I was invited to write a poem for a hospital this year and read the poem is installed in this hospital setting, and I gave a reading with the CEO, and he was talking with me about Amanda Gorman, and I just thought, this is a very different kind of moment, that people are more aware of poetry and healing power, certainly from that pivotal moment that happened for the country. And I think that there are new doors opening that we might not even realize are open. In other words, when a hospital contacted me to do this, I was like, are you sure? What do you want me to do? But as someone who has, like most people, spent time in a hospital in the more traumatic end of it, I realized I really wanted to be able to connect there. But how does that affect journals? I think it also is there's a possibility to connect with different kinds of larger organizations that you might not have thought before would be interested in a little poetry journal, as you were phrasing it, not that it's little, but that there is an openness to engage with the spoken word and how intensely powerful it is. And there, I think, is an increasing respect for that generationally. So apparently, readership of poetry has gone way up, just statistically, and it's largely under 30. So we can be really encouraged also that the generation that's growing up, whatever line of work they end up in, they could be STEM people, there's a good chance that they're also more open to being engaged with literary arts. And it's people of color too, are feeling more engaged in this community. So the readership is actually way up. And I think not just for people in MFA programs. So I think there's a lot more cross-pollinating that can happen and that I'm excited to be a part of, hopefully ongoing. I was raised by scientists, full disclosure, by my mother, a pediatric immunologist, and my stepdad, a physicist turned computer programmer. So I was definitely raised by people on that end, but who definitely read a lot of poetry too. So more cross-pollination.
And Annie, what do you think?
Well, I wasn't raised by scientists, Danusha, but I'm married to one. He's a physicist too. So I do get, some points of conversation from him as well regarding these issues. I guess the question for me as we go forward is, how do we balance advocacy and our social awareness, political awareness with aesthetic form? We don't want art to become a social document or a historical document and nothing more than that. And at the same time, we don't want to retreat into an ivory tower either. So perhaps the question is, how do we balance, or perhaps we should, maybe moving forward, we should find some way of balancing form and function so that we don't get carried away one way or the other. And there's that balance. I don't know how we do this, but that's something I've always considered. It's always been important to me. On a more positive note, I'd like to say that literature reflects who we are. It's how we see the world. It's how we make meaning of the world. And that's a very human impulse. So I don't think that's ever going to go away. So if that's a positive note, I think we'll always have some kind of art, some kind of literature going forward.
Julie, do you want to just weigh in just a tiny little bit?
I will only weigh in a tiny little bit because I want to hear from Danusha and her poems that will take us out. I think the support for the arts will be there as long as we remain and are conscious of how we're relevant to people's lives. We need to be storytellers for the moments that we're living through. We need to think about how we serve our communities, how we're humble in our listening. I think the future is bright because there is more consciousness about relevance to our communities and the people we serve. But Danusha, I'm hoping you can read us out.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks to all of you. This has been so fruitful and enjoyable. And I guess we're living the benefits right now of these strange times by getting to spend this moment together, these moments together.
Let me just interject one thing as you
Yeah,
get ready.
please.
One of the points that I think we shouldn't miss as we leave this conversation is, in a polarized society, it doesn't seem to be getting better. The cure would be empathy. The more people are polarized, the less they are looking at each other. The cure is arts. That is the cure. And that's why it is also essential. It is a way to not only bridge differences, but without the kinds of support and the advocacy for how what we do contributes to that, and if that connection is not clearly made, then I'm not sure how we're going to ever get there, because the audience is smaller by nature of the polarization. So with that, we're going to conclude our CODA and our series with two poems by Danusha Laméris. Thank you, everybody, for staying with our series. Thank you, Anchorage Museum, for sponsoring us and hosting us. Thank you, Heather Lendy, for being our moderator for 21 Sundays. Thank you, Danielle, Manini, for joining us today. Danusha?
Thank you so much. And I think I'll take us out with one, since I feel we're just on a topic here. I'll go with that topic. And it's a poem called Nothing Wants to Suffer, a line I found in the beautiful book called Dwellings by the Native American writer and poet Linda Hogan. Nothing wants to suffer. Not the wind, as it scrapes itself against the cliff. Not the cliff being eaten slowly by the sea. The earth does not want to suffer the rough tread of those who do not notice it. The trees do not want to suffer the axe, nor see their sisters felled by root rot, mildew, rust. The coyote in its den, the puma stalking its prey. These too want ease and a tender animal in the mouth to take their hunger, an offering, one hopes, made quickly and without much suffering. The chair mourns an angry sitter, the lamp a scalded moth, a table the weight of years of argument. We know this, though we forget. Not the shark, nor the tiger, fanged as they are, not the worm, content in its windowless world of soil and stone, not the stone, resting in its riverbed, the riverbed gazing up at the stars, least of all the stars, ensconced in their canopy, looking down at all of us, their offspring, scattered so far beyond reach. So thank you, everybody, and good to be with all of you till we meet again.